I've made videos in the past about how to study for coding interviews and people seem to find them helpful, but a lot has changed in the last couple years. The market has become far more competitive, interview styles have actually shifted a little bit, and this massive surge in AI has created brand new ways to actually study for coding interviews that are very, very effective. And we'll talk about all of this in a minute. But first, it's important to set expectations for what types of coding interviews you'll even get. If you're applying to the big FANG style tech companies, you'll likely see primarily data structure and algorithm coding interviews. And these are what we'll mostly focus on in this video, but do note that most of these techniques should apply to most styles of coding interviews. However, if you are applying to other types of companies, say just a random local bank, for example, as a software engineer, there's a good chance you get other types of coding interviews. These could be take-home tests, or they could be some kind of practical coding challenge, or even just behavioral style coding interview questions. So just do your research on the companies you're applying to get a better idea of what you can expect. Next, you need to make sure you have the core skills necessary to actually tackle coding interview questions. And the first of these is, of course, that you need to know how to code. Now, most tech companies will allow you to do coding interviews in whatever language you're most comfortable in. For example, in my coding interviews as a new grad, I did most of them in Java just because that's the language I knew best at the time. That said, some languages are far better choices than others for the purpose of coding interviews. For example, C++ is far more verbose than a language like Python. This means that on average, you'll probably end up writing more code if you do C++, and theoretically, this is going to take more time, which is a bad thing because these are timed coding interviews. So the question that always comes up is, should you learn a new language for the purpose of coding interviews? And my thought on this has changed a little bit in recent years, but here's my current thought. If you have a coding interview in the next, say, 3 months, I would just focus on whatever language you already know best. But if you have more prep time, then learning a new language like Python that can be good for coding interviews could be a good idea if you'd otherwise be using something like C++ or Java that are far more verbose. And the next prerequisite is one that's oftentimes overlooked, but it is super important as it causes a lot of issues in actual coding interviews, and that's going to be time and space complexity analysis. At the end of nearly every coding interview, they're going to ask you, what is the time and space complexity of your solution? And of course, you want to know how to answer this, but even if they don't ask you this question, you should usually be volunteering this information to show that it's something you're thinking about. In fact, in most of my coding interviews, I openly bring this up before I even start writing code. This is a way to show that it's part of my thought process and something I'm actively thinking about when narrowing down possible solutions to the best solution that I actually want to implement. And all time complexity really is a way to roughly estimate the performance of a function. Specifically, we'll be using big O notation, and in the context of a coding interview, this is going to be an asymptotic upper bound on the growth rate of the algorithm's runtime as input sizes get very large. And when we talk about space complexity, it's also going to be using big O notation, but this time it's going to be an asymptotic upper bound on the growth rate of memory usage by the algorithm, again, as input sizes get very large. Now, the other key prerequisite that you'll want to focus on is, of course, data structures and algorithms. Specifically for data structures, you'll want to focus on arrays, stacks, queues, sets, maps, linked lists, trees, and there's a bunch of different types of trees to know, like binary search trees and graphs. And for each of these, you'll want to understand its purpose, the common use cases, the time complexities using big O notation of all of the different operations, such as adding and removing elements, when you should or shouldn't be using them, what the pros and cons are, and of course, how to actually implement them. You'll also want to know how to implement some of the more common famous algorithms, such as binary search, depth first search, breadth first search, Dijkstra's algorithm, different sorting algorithms such as merge sort and bubble sort. And for each of these algorithms, you'll want to know the time and space complexity using big O notation and just the general use cases and how to recognize when you might have a good use case for that particular algorithm. Now, I know this can sound like a lot of prerequisites, and it is, but I've actually found that if you focus on those first, you can actually learn how to get good at coding interviews far quicker. For example, I never did hundreds of questions on LeetCode or AlgoExpert or any of that. I did use some of those sites, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But before I ever did, I focused on the fundamentals. I took multiple courses in data structures and algorithms before I ever did a single coding interview question, and because of this, I had good, strong fundamentals before I actually started the coding interview questions. Put simply, this meant that I learned how to walk before I ever tried to learn how to run, and personally, I think this was very important towards my own success. But now there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different practice questions across different platforms. So how do you best approach this? And I've seen plenty of people try to sort of game the system by finding questions asked by companies they're planning to interview at or similar tactics, but honestly, I don't think any of this is actually necessary. Instead, just start with some easy problems and slowly work your way up to mediums and hards. If you're using a site like AlgoExpert that curates problems for you, then just choose any of them. And if you're using a site that doesn't do this, then just choose the ones that have the most upvotes, as these are probably the best questions. And the goal here isn't to memorize solutions, it's to focus on problem solving and pattern recognition. Ultimately, you probably will never see one of these questions in an actual coding interview, but nearly every coding interview question you ever get will rely on these same patterns. Now with each question, try to treat it as close to a real interview as possible. And the first step of this is figuring out how you are actually graded in a coding interview. Of course, this differs from company to company, but here's an example criteria that's used on the AlgoExpert mock interview platform, which I believe is based on the Google criteria. And it has 4 categories: algorithms, coding, communication, and problem solving. And as such, we are going to focus our practicing on making sure we are able to hit all 4 of these categories. So first, after reading the prompt, come up with some clarifying questions that you would ask an interviewer in a real interview. This is a good first step that you should be doing in nearly every single interview, so of course you should also be practicing it. Next, spend a few minutes thinking about high-level solutions. Usually start with the brute force solution, and then think about different optimizations you can make and how they will improve the time or space complexity, as well as just the implementation complexity. And in an actual interview, you'd want to be articulating this thought process, so practice actually doing that. So say these things out loud as you go through them. And then as you code out your solution, do pretty much the same thing. So for each code block, just describe what exactly it is that you're about to write. So what is this doing? What is its purpose? This helps you gain communication points, but also just helps the interviewer to actually follow along. And then for individual lines of code, you'll want to speak through this thought process too, but make sure not to go too deep here and too overboard. You don't want to be trying to explain how to code to your interviewer. They know what an if check is, they know that you know what an if check is, no need to explain that type of stuff. But what you should be explaining is things like, what is the purpose of this particular if check? Why are you using an if check? And why did you choose the condition that you did choose? Along with this, just focus on writing clean code. This is not competitive programming. You want to use descriptive variable names, a consistent style, avoid putting all of your code on one line, and use idiomatic coding conventions to the language that you're actually using. You want the interviewer to feel like they would want to work with somebody who codes in the way you do. And a good way to practice this is actually using ChatGPT. So take some code you write and put it into ChatGPT and ask it just to make that code cleaner. Oftentimes it won't do much of anything, which means you probably did a good job, but other times it will come with some suggestions and you can learn from those suggestions to write cleaner code in the future. And after you finish a problem, make sure to think through the different edge cases as well as the time and space complexities. And again, practice this like an actual interview, so actually say it out loud and describe how you came to your conclusion. But now, you won't be able to solve every single question, and that's a good thing. If you did, you wouldn't actually be learning. And this is an area where my viewpoints have shifted a little bit recently as technology has been evolving. And in the case you can't solve a problem, of course, look to the solution. This can be in the form of videos or other user solutions or official solutions on whatever website you're using. Or another great way to do this is using ChatGPT. Of course, be careful here as it can give incorrect solutions, but I find more often than not, especially with a good, well-written prompt, ChatGPT does a great job of actually explaining how to come to solutions in these coding interview problems. And once you feel like you understand a solution, this is the most important part. Don't solve it, because at this point, all you've done is sort of stored the solution in short-term memory. But we aren't training memorization. We are training problem solving. So come back to the problem a few days later, because at that point you will have forgotten the implementation details and you can sort of solve it from scratch to make sure you actually learned how to go about solving problems like this one. And from here, you'll want to just continue doing more and more problems, as well as doing mock interviews if you have access to anybody to do them with. And then you'll want to watch this video next that the YouTube algorithm thinks you'll enjoy. Let me know if it's right.